program of action recognizes that healthy families are created by choice, not by chance.
That journey that began 25 years ago is far from over. It's now time to finish that unfinished business.
The Sustainable Development Goals cannot and will not be achieved until women, girls, and young people are able to control their bodies and their lives, free from fear and from violence.
Moving forward, we will not retreat. We will never give up. We are in a race to the finish line, and we shall prevail. Thank you. Nashukuru sana.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Barbara Adams, and I am delighted to welcome you now to this 8th and final dialogue in a series of global thought leadership conversations, today featuring women's agency and poverty eradication in small island developing states. We have a great panel and a program today to explore not only the decisions and momentum that we have from ICPD, as you've seen 25 years ago, and also the Nairobi summit, but actually also to keep the momentum going in the series of what's next to be sure that we achieve these. The program and the panel today will give undivided attention to gender equality, poverty eradication, and small island developing states. To overcome gender inequality and to secure rights, we know we need to move beyond being equal in the aggregate to addressing the different barriers that women face in securing their rights. And ICPD and the Nairobi summit have been in the forefront, not only of naming this, but of charting a course for success. And similarly for small island developing states, policies, international agreements, and sustainable development cooperation frameworks need to recognize, they need to respect, and they need to respond to the particular vulnerabilities and the need for fiscal and policy space that shape a sustainable development path, be that in the areas of trade, in finance, in investment, and certainly with regard to the climate emergency. And as we are seeing and confronting as well, all amplified, exacerbated, and exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I move to our speaker, I would like to, first speaker, I would like to introduce you quickly to the panelists today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Natalia Kanem, Under Secretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA. And if I may say now, the architect with the team at UNFPA of the Nairobi Summit. Our second speaker will be Ambassador Elizabeth Thompson. A special welcome to Ambassador Thompson, who has joined us at short notice due to unforeseen circumstances that meant that the Prime Minister was not able to join us. We really appreciate you joining us today. We also have Undersecretary General Ute Kamanu, who is Undersecretary General and High Representative at the United Nations Office of a lot of responsibility, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. We will welcome Christina Duarte, United Nations Special Advisor on Africa and responsible for the Undersecretary General with regard to that office. Then we will also have Mr. Ib Peterson, I'm not very good at Danish, I apologize, who is UNFPA Deputy Executive Director. Ms. Therese Turner-Jones, Inter-America Development Bank, who is General Manager for the Country Department Caribbean Program, and Alexander Girvan, Independent Environmental Economist. We are also going to be welcoming a cultural interlude from the Bishop Anstey High School Steel Ensemble in Trinidad and Tobago. As you can see, we have a very full program. I encourage you to join us with all forms of medium. I encourage you to use the chat. I encourage you to tweet with gay abandon, perhaps, and to also remind you of the hashtag What's Next for Women. So let me now turn to our first speaker, Dr. Natalia Kanem. I have already mentioned your leadership role with regard to the Nairobi Summit, and we eagerly await your remarks. Natalia.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. I'd like to thank you as President and Board Chair of the Global Policy Forum for joining us, and also the New School for having you with us. I'd also like to say a special word of welcome to Ambassador Elizabeth Thompson, and to thank you for joining us. Our best to the Prime Minister. She is one of the leading and most cogent global voices on the issues that we're speaking about today in this 8th and final conversation in the What's Next After ICPD 25 series. I'm excited that the conversations really have sparked the continued momentum around the Nairobi commitments. That was our hope coming out of last year. And every step of the way, we at UNFPA have drawn strength from our collective commitment. And that's one that says to realize the vision of the ICPD program of action and to deliver on the promises that were made so many years ago to women and girls. We have to keep our ambition high, even at a time of COVID, where COVID-19 has to sharpen our focus and resolve, not to be daunted. I believe that COVID also has given us an unprecedented opportunity to talk about inequality. The loss of the life of George Floyd has given us the opportunity to talk about who is marginalized. And among these, afrodescendientes, African and Indigenous people must always be asked to lead a fight where they know where the rubber hits the road. And I think it's also shown us a lot about solidarity and how we can work together to popularize the notion that it's all about dignity for a 10-year-old girl growing up and coming into womanhood. Nowhere has this been more evident than in small island developing states, so-called SIDS, who are all too familiar with the devastation that can be wrought by climate change, by external shocks, by economic disruptions, which tend to affect women disproportionately. So when we talk about how to build resilience, these may be some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities and countries, but everyone has a lot to learn from them. And that's what we intend to do today. I would like to stress that the right to sexual and reproductive health, the right to autonomy over one's body. This is part of economic empowerment. A woman's fertility, a girl's ability to finish school, not to be stigmatized because of biological functions like menstruation. All of this is part of an empowerment path. It's a path towards gender equality, poverty eradication, and the type of economic growth that is inclusive. Now, while there may be multiplier effects going on in terms of sustainable development that are clear and profound, we know that an empowered woman can generate income for herself, for her family. We also understand that contributing to the recovery efforts after COVID, we're going to need women in SIDS countries to take the reins and lead. The Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean is saying that reducing gender inequality is going to be the key to jumpstart these efforts going forward. And UNFPA, as we work with partners, as we work with adolescent girls, women in small island developing states, we are using everything we know to make sure that that path to pregnancy is safe. Everything we can do to protect women and girls, because a lot of adolescent girls have unintended pregnancies. Contraception, very, very important. And our zero on zero gender-based violence. Our zero making sure that every woman is respected, that there is recourse for her and shelter for her and her children as needed. Ending violence right across the world is part of an issue that SIDS countries also are stepping up to deal with, and all hands have to work towards, because it is going to take all of us. The international organizations, the governments, countries, large and small, civil society, which has shouldered a lot of this burden. In November, we oranged the world against violence against women. And of course, the private sector. I'm excited to hear how all of these are going to come together as we conquer these inequalities, as we do something to make sure that women are never held back. It was Shirley Chisholm. She was the first Black woman to run for president of the United States. And it's an election day today. Shirley Chisholm said, "You don't make progress standing on the sidelines. You make progress by implementing ideas." So let us act swiftly and in solidarity to bring together ideas that are going to help us lift women up, protect and defend the dignity of girls, and really lift all of society up, because when we pave the way for a more prosperous and sustainable future for women, it means a more prosperous and sustainable future for all. So with that, thank you so much to everyone that's joined from all around the world. Excited to see your comments as well. And I look forward to the discussion today. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for bringing out straight away so many important issues. Not a shopping list of how the ability to exercise one's rights is pick and choose, but how it cuts across and benefits individuals, communities, and addresses inequalities in all kinds of ways. I have to say, I like the comments about getting to zero on violence. And one of the things that I think we need to do is to broaden the way we measure and talk about violence. We talk about multidimensional poverty. We don't talk about multidimensional violence. And I think we need to enumerate in these ways and how they interact. I had the pleasure and privilege of listening to Prime Minister Motley's statement a few weeks ago at the UN High-Level General Assembly. And one of the aspects that was really striking there was the way in which that integrated, connected way of how to overcome barriers, and also the call for new approach to global solidarity was paramount. I will turn to Ambassador Thompson at this moment. Ambassador Thompson has had so much experience, both with the government of Barbados, with so many different parts of the United Nations. I think if there's anybody who is going to be able to unlock and help us find a way forward with regard to the barriers we need to overcome, it will be Ambassador Thompson.
Look at me. The face of poverty looks like mine. The face of poverty is female. My gender bears the overwhelming burden of poverty in every region of the world. Is it not a tragedy? Is it not a travesty that those who have given life to every single of the world's 7.8 billion people are themselves the furthest behind in development and well-being? I start my remarks today with this stark reality, which is intended to focus our attention on the fact that our circumstances could be very different. Any female here could have walked miles today collecting firewood and could now be standing cooking on an indoor fire with a child holding on to our leg, inhaling the fumes, condemning us both to disease and early death. Any woman in this virtual space today could be the victim of domestic abuse. Any of you ladies could be the ones denied healthcare, education, and rights to land ownership. Any woman within the sound of my voice could be sharing the cruel fates of billions of our sisters on every continent and in SIDS. Our responsibility, therefore, is to make the life livable, bearable, and tolerable by transforming the circumstances of those sisters who suffer across our world. Our obligation is to ensure that at Beijing +30, +40, +50, the narrative told by the sisters who succeed us, by those yet unborn, is happier, and the yoke of poverty does not weigh them down the way it does our generation. Fully conscious of my responsibility and obligation to future generations of women, especially those who will have to carry the additional weight of racism, I'm grateful for the opportunity to join this important discussion. It is in this context that I thank you for your kind introduction, Barbara. I express my appreciation to Dr. Kanem, the UNFPA Executive Director, and say hello to my friend Eve Peterson, well understanding the role that should be played is an important one if the changes that are necessary are brought about. Fellow presenters, sisters and brothers watching in virtual space, good morning to all of you. We gather today to discuss the eradication of poverty and the empowerment of women, 1 year after observing the 25th anniversary of the landmark International Conference on Population and Development in Nairobi, and 25 years after the historic meeting at Beijing, where the platform for action to advance, enfranchise, and empower women was first enunciated. We do so conscious that the job of gender equity is incomplete. People often look on at the small island developing states generally and in the Caribbean specifically and assume that the absence of bars to property ownership and the existence of universal access to health care and education mean that the gender gap has been closed. That is far from the reality. Statistics for the Caribbean region show that the majority of poor people are still female, that female-led households and families experience higher margins of poverty, that while women are over 60% of university graduates, there are still more unemployed or underemployed women than men, and that women do not earn 100 cents to a man's dollar, especially in the private sector. Women are in fewer leadership roles in our societies and economies, whether on boards at executive level or in our parliaments. In CARICOM, female representation in parliament is as low as 3 to 9 and 11% at the lowest levels, and a mere 31, 34, and 35% at the highest. Our reality is that this region is still a long way away from gender parity. This suggests the presence of entrenched gender biases and the need for targeted policy interventions. The World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap 2019 gave readers pause. It indicated that women's participation in the labor market is stalling and financial disparities are larger, and that is a direct quote. The report said that, and I quote again, projecting current trends into the future, the overall global gender gap will close in 99.5 years on average across the 107 countries covered continuously since the first edition of the report. End of quote. For all our efforts to have women regarded as equal, as valuable and valued members of the human family, the gap to parity is still 100 years wide. What moved the WEF report from sobering to depressing is the fact that it predated the COVID-19 pandemic. The novel coronavirus disease has halted all of the development gains we as small island developing states were making and has placed our attainment of the SDGs in jeopardy. The digital divide has become a chasm. Monies have had to be diverted to our national responses to the pandemic. Hence, we categorize COVID as a major threat to development. It has placed regional healthcare systems under severe stress as microstates with small budgets and smaller resources buckle under the pressure of trying to keep citizens alive. It has caused unemployment to skyrocket. Bear in mind that the CARICOM region has 15 of the world's top tourism destinations, and that this sector has been decimated by the COVID pandemic, the second wave of which is pushing resuscitation of our economies further away unless there is an urgent capital injection into the Caribbean economies and into SIDS economies. Tourism is a sector like teaching, the clerical professions, and healthcare, which employs large numbers of women. These are now losing their jobs. With stay-at-home orders and lockdowns, women in our islands are increasingly the victims of escalating domestic violence, suffering increased incidences of mental illness, under greater stress as they try to care for family members and children who've been affected by the disease in various ways, or as they themselves are on the front lines of the fight, such as our nurses. It has hampered opportunities for school-aged children to access education. I want, in the time remaining to me, to pose two questions and to quickly suggest some possible approaches for addressing the challenges of gender development. First, what must we as SIDS and a global community do to make the post-COVID playing field even more level for women and girls? How can we ensure that they are enfranchised, empowered, and freed from all vestiges of poverty? At the macro level, small states need to be given access to concessionary financing and debt relief, particularly those which are classified as middle-income countries and those which are highly vulnerable, such as Caribbean and Pacific SIDS, so as to allow these countries the fiscal and policy space to pursue their domestic development agendas. In terms of more generic policy at the national and regional levels, we must reset our climate agendas and press ahead with our resilience capacity building. In looking to specific policy approaches for gender, may I suggest work at exploding the myth that women in the Caribbean SIDS have broken all glass ceilings and are now at job, financial, and social parity. The longer that belief is held, the more lethargy there will be in giving further impetus to changing the circumstances of women. Conducting gender sensitivity training, starting in the schools and encouraging such programs in the private sector. Embark on incentivization programs as carrots and legislation as sticks to accelerate changes in the labor market which are favorable to women. Initiate negotiation and conflict resolution skills training in schools and at the community level, making such training mandatory for those charged with domestic abuse. Require government and private sector entities to have affirmative action procurement policies for female-owned businesses. Ensure that all policy is subjected to gender evaluation to determine if it will help or hinder progress toward gender parity. Close the digital divide for women by ensuring they have the skills and equipment to compete in a technology-driven market and in other fields where they need either skilling, reskilling, or upskilling. Analyze the factors which perpetuate female poverty and wrestle them to the ground with policy, legislation, incentivization, regulation, and all the tools available to policymakers and legislators. Friends, this topic is one which invites much discussion and deliberate action. Barbados commits to taking the necessary action to effect positive change. But on the matter of discussion, I fear that I have already overstepped the allotted time. I take encouragement, however, from the words of Maya Angelou. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I'll rise into daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, I rise, I rise. And I look to the day, I hope not far away, when the future generations of women can say, we have risen. Thank you so much.
Thank you really very much to you and Prime Minister Motley for your words, a very powerful speech, and certainly putting on this agenda and all of our agendas so many important issues. I have to say, listening to those statistics about 100 years and 99.5, I couldn't help but wonder, how do we make this more imperative in our science policy interface discussion? We talk so much about the importance of better data, but we don't seem to be able to develop the right kind of policy space and ways forward for the data we already have, let alone the fact that we know we need more. And thinking of your remarks about the impact of COVID, I think there are some very important issues we have to pay attention to. In some ways, it's almost as though people see COVID in two different ways. One, as revealing pre-existing conditions of inequalities and insecurities that have to be addressed. And on the other hand, somehow or other hitting a pause button, as if we're going to pick up afterwards and just carry on the way we were, which clearly we cannot do. And if there's one area where we really can't ignore what has been revealed, it is the whole business of the digital divide and the barriers to women's participation in that area. I hope the debt crisis and strategies to address that have existed before and are being exacerbated by the pandemic are going to be a continuing theme as we go through our program today. I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, Undersecretary General Ute Kamanu. As I had mentioned, one of her major responsibilities is with regard to the UN program on small island developing states. and also the implementation of the Samoa pathway with regard to that. We also bring to the table experience from being in the government, from government experience in Tonga, and also from academia. Undersecretary General Ute Kamanu, I turn to you now, please.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Greetings. Firstly, I want to thank my colleague and friend Natalia and UNFPA for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. The question you posed today not only is most relevant to my office work, but as a woman from a Pacific Island nation, I have throughout my work life at national, regional, and global level promoted a powerful agency by women. I have done so because I know I have seen so many women's invaluable contributions to building resilience in SIDS, and that at all levels. I recall a conversation that I had with colleagues over a decade ago, reflecting on how far we have come on gender equality and human rights issues. Through decades of lobbying efforts and commitments at the national, regional, and global levels by various stakeholders, including politicians, government, civil society, academia, private sector, and bilateral and multilateral development partners, we have seen many changes. Although we have come a long way, even now in 2020, there is still much more to be done. It also shows the complexity of the issue. There are many moving parts and all need to move forward together. Reverting to the question, what is the single most critical issue which holds women back? First, I do not think there's one single most critical issue. It's usually a confluence, a mixture of issues holding women back. But what surely stands out, and that is the case elsewhere, is socio-economic inequality. This inequality starts with access to education. It impacts on women's family choices, such as the number of children you have, women's health status. It impacts on their economic independence, with all that dependence implies. So socio-economic inequality is a key driver in holding women back, and it has serious impacts on women and girls in small island developing states. SIDS are a special case for sustainable development. We all know such generic features such as their spatial geography, remoteness, comparatively small population size. For SIDS, including the Pacific Island countries, gender issues vary according to the political climate, social and cultural norms, and level of economic development. These specificities also demand specific policies. Now, what certainly has tremendously grown over, I would say, the last 2 to 3 decades is their vulnerability to exogenous shocks. Climate change and now COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionate impacts. Just think how fast a pandemic potentially spreads among small communities. It could wipe out entire populations because you do not have the public health system and financial capacities large and developed countries can deploy. So you take the given challenges, you add the accelerating severe impacts of climate change and now a global pandemic. And what is the situation? In simple terms, it means that SIDS are at high risk of being left behind, being left out of getting a chance to achieve their sustainable development goals. Already, women and girls are disproportionately affected, and they will be even more affected. Women already experience higher rates of unemployment, unequal access to finance, have to struggle more to keep their families going. The data shows that at a macro level, women still earn about 20% less than men. Such a macro data hide how in the SIDS the situation is much more pronounced. Take the tourism sector or finance or manufacturing. Women too often are stuck in basic services, jobs, and earn less. Now with the pandemic and tourism almost wiped out, many women lost their jobs. Yet tourism is a key economic driver in many cities. Women are also disproportionately represented in the informal economic sectors, which are heavily impacted by the pandemic. As we have seen, pretty much all countries, the lockdown associated with the pandemic have led to rapidly rising rates of domestic violence. Gender-based violence rates in SIDS generally are unacceptably high, but have risen even further. This pressing issue was already recognized by SIDS as a growing concern during the high-level midterm review of the Samoa pathway last year. The COVID-19 pandemic has most definitely heightened the vulnerabilities of women across all socioeconomic strata. This is why I've said at the onset, there's not just one issue. We need to address all issues related to gender inequality in SIDS. From the perspective of multilateral cooperation, we also have a tool, and it is the Samoa pathway, where all member states affirm the importance of gender equality and the need to step up efforts to promote gender parity and women's economic and political empowerment, as well as to address gender-based violence. They also call for specific actions around promoting and enhancing gender equality in SIDS. Last year, the outcome of the high-level review of the Samoa pathway recognized that gender equality and women's empowerment and the full realization of human rights for women and girls is a top priority. We know that empowering women and girls have a great transformative and multiplier effects for sustainable development and can drive economic growth in SIDS. The outcome stresses the need for concrete actions towards this end. Indeed, it is through the implementation of the Samoa pathway that we will go a long way in supporting women to remove the proverbial chains that hold women back in SIDS. OHR LLS will continue to support and encourage these concrete actions. Now, action has to be grounded in facts and data, and that is why we must continue investment in strengthening statistical systems. It is the way to ensure that policies are informed by more comprehensive information on the situation of women and girls in SIDS. We all continue to promote genuine and durable partnerships in SIDS, partnerships that not only address the economics of gender inequality, we must invest in and also account for the behavioral change as they relate, but are not limited to the engagement of men and boys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, as you point out, there cannot be only one answer. And we know there isn't only one program, but I think we have to acknowledge that there have to be some overriding values and principles that all programs and all approaches would need to respond to. And possibly this is the right time to ask Ms. Therese Turner-Jones what the 2 or 3 critical elements are that would help women to overcome economic inequalities and poverty. Because one of the areas that we have to look at as well is how do these priorities that we're speaking about end up being drivers and end up being part of the accountability framing for so many of the major macroeconomic institutions of which you have tremendous experience. That your experience now with the Inter-America Development Bank and experience with ministries of finance, experiences with regard to the International Monetary Fund, I think will provide us some very valuable advice as to how to really make sure that the various macroeconomic programs are accountable to women's rights. Therese.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And as I looked at my prepared notes and as I was listening to Ambassador Thompson deliver Prime Minister Motley's remarks and also listening to the USG, I've had to adjust my thoughts a little bit because I think they've already put a lot on the table.
So can I, sorry to interrupt you, but,
yes.
And I really welcome that you are responding and interactive. Please excuse me if after 5 minutes I give you a 5-minute warning, because I
Absolutely.
expect that you will be quite inspired.
I may just hit the 5-minute target. First of all, let me say how pleased I am to be participating in this UNFPA and this UN event on women's agency. especially in the 75th year of the UN's anniversary. I want to acknowledge that. So we've been in this business a long time, trying to drive the agenda for women's rights and equality, and also just fairness across the globe on a whole host of areas. The IDB has been in existence we're in our 61st year. And I must say, having been associated with the IDB for the last 7 years, I'm really proud to be part of an organization that has gender as a cross-cutting theme. And we do it by looking at every single project, every single aspect of our advice. Where can we advance these issues? I want to pick up on the issue of that was mentioned by PM Motley, by Ambassador, about it being livable, bearable, and tolerable, because I think they align with the three thoughts I have about what we can do to impact women's inequality, especially on an economic front. First of all, on the livable part, and I think this goes directly to the issues that have been mentioned by the previous speakers about inequality in terms of the burden of household chores and the fact that women have to balance both. And this comes as an economic indicator when we look at the labor force participation rates of women throughout the region. And generally, women's labor force participation rates tend to be lower. So for example, in Jamaica, in the last labor force survey, which was released just a couple of weeks ago, the women's participation rate actually fell to 54.5% compared with 68% from men. I think that suggests a huge gap in who's actually doing the work in the countries in this region. And that's really significant, because with 50% of the population, we expect to see a much higher rate. We want to see 100% of women participating in the labor force, but we know for all kinds of reasons that doesn't happen. We still need to adjust what is the imbalance going on in the household. A lot of people alluded to some of the issues today, whether it's childcare, whether it's elder care, whether it's cooking, whether it's whatever you're doing to keep your household together. That burden falls disproportionately on women than on men. We've seen a lot of attitudinal behavioral changes in developed countries around this aspect of our lives. But we know that in the Caribbean, especially, because of toxic masculinity, and that's a whole other discussion, but I think everybody gets what that means, it's still not an equal level playing field when Caribbean women or SIDS women return to the home. They're basically doing the looking after the kids, they're looking after the food, they're looking after the spouse or partner, and they're responsible. We saw this exacerbated in the surveys we did in April, and also the UN survey that was done on the impact of COVID. We saw that in our survey, which was done in April, that between 74 and 89% of all of those domestic chores were being borne by women as a result of the pandemic. So that's one imbalance that needs to be corrected. I think if we can correct what's happening at home, in addition to the fact that, as it was alluded to earlier, women are being affected by domestic violence. And we saw that also from our survey and also from your survey, that low-income women in particular suffered more domestic abuse during the pandemic. So this has to be corrected. That's my point one. That goes to Mia Motley's point about a livable situation for women. Secondly, on making it bearable, what can we do to make women's lives more bearable? How do we go about that? I think the previous speaker mentioned education. In the Caribbean, what we're seeing actually is a reverse in terms of who has access to education. We're seeing boys falling out earlier from school, whether it's 5th grade in primary school. We're seeing more women matriculating at the tertiary level institutions. So we're seeing that women are achieving the qualifications to enter into the workplace, but we know that once they start trying to get a job, there are the barriers. So I think more education is better than none. And we talked about upskilling, reskilling, retooling, whatever we want to call it. The education that we need for this 21st century, where we're interacting with artificial intelligence and more technology, is going to be a different kind of education. And we think that this can be an equalizer to help women participate more. And finally, on the issue of what can be more tolerable for women, part of our vision for the Caribbean right now is to see how much we can advance on digital transformation. It has been mentioned earlier this morning that this is important, but I think this can be a real equalizer along many dimensions. One, most of us are now working from home in this COVID pandemic. What we're hearing from surveys that we're seeing and surveys that we're carrying out is that most people who have adjusted to this work from home environment would prefer to keep at least 2 out of the 5 days working from home or not going into the office. So we're going to see actually a structural shift in how the workplace changes as a result of this pandemic. What are the lessons here for us? I think for the labor market, it may open up more opportunities for women, especially because we talked about the fact that they're bearing more responsibilities in the household. It can open up more opportunities for women because now you can actually start your own business from home. Everything is going online. E-commerce is important. Becoming digitally literate is a skill that our kids need for the future. And I think this can be another equalizer to bring this elusive task of women's inequality closer to a reality. I want to stop there, but I think I just want to congratulate you for bringing us all together for this very important conversation. I want to also, just my last point is on data because it came up. There are some statistical institutes in our region that are doing a really good job, and I want to make a particular shout out for STATIN, which is the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, because just last month, in addition to producing the labor force survey results, they did a special, and they're going to be doing this until the pandemic leaves us. They did a special survey attached to the labor force survey that looked at knowledge, attitude, and practices during the COVID period. I would suggest that everybody go and download that survey because there's some excellent disaggregation of information about who's affected, how it's being affected, what are the attitudes of women versus men in this pandemic, and what are we learning as a result? Some of which I mentioned earlier, that women would see that a lot of us are feeling that working from home is not a bad thing. We're not dealing with traffic. We can more easily deal with the schooling of our kids now that so many children are doing online learning. So there's a lot of information to unpack there. I think when we come out of this period of the pandemic, we're going to find that as bad and as dark as these days seem, there will be a lot of bridges to help us build a better and more equitable future for women and children in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your discipline, but also responding so concretely to what we've heard already today. And responding with some very specific references and recommendations. The other thing I think that you have threaded into the conversation very, very helpfully is the recognition of the way in which the pandemic is actually challenging, undermining so many other development gains, but also the way, as has already been mentioned by previous speakers, that we have to look at this as the opportunity, excuse me, Mr. Secretary General, not to build back better, but to build forward. And I think that you have put some very concrete ideas here for us to mull over, although I encourage you at the moment not to mull, but just to relax, because this is the moment now for us to breathe out and to have a cultural interlude, which will be from the Bishop Anstey High School Steel Ensemble. And I ask Jade Brown and Kaylin Lee Fook, who are captain and vice captain, to introduce the selection for us. JD and Kaylin.
Bars of Steel is a high school steel orchestra belonging to the Bishop Anstey High School, Port of Spain. It consists of 50 girls of all ages throughout the school. In 2019, the band was reformed by Ms. Tamara Martin and performed in the National Junior Panorama. After 17 years of abstention, we placed first overall in the preliminary round and third overall in the final. As our first performance, we played I Am Love by Nyla Blackman, arranged by Mr. Barry Manett.
Thank you. I don't know about anybody else, but I can see a lot of people have turned off their videos. I know exactly why. I was tempted to do the same because I wanted to get up and move. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very, very much. So I am going to turn to Christina Duarte, but with the same question that we have already had about what are the 2 or 3 critical elements that would help women to overcome economic inequalities and poverty. And really look forward to your analysis and advice, bringing very rich experience to this conversation as a minister in Cape Verde, as in the private sector, and the experience with, for example, Citibank. And also, maybe people don't know this, but also a member of one of my absolutely favorite UN processes or committees, the UN Committee of Experts on Public Administration. I think that the public-private experience that you bring to this conversation will be very, very interesting. Also from the perspective of the special situation of Africa, we are talking about countries at different stages of development with very specific, differentiated vulnerabilities that need to be respected, but within the universal framework of the right to development. Christina, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And again, thank you for inviting me. So I will try to be a very disciplined girl, and I will respond to the questions. So I will mention 2 critical elements that has been preventing human to overcome economic inequalities and then poverty. For me, the first critical element is the no access to knowledge and information. And it goes beyond the access to education. The access to knowledge and information is much, much more than the access to education. Universal education in the sense of putting every girl child in a school room is just the first step. And when you reach this first step, policymakers should be conscious that they still far away of considered mission accomplished. Cape Verde, small island state. From a formal education standpoint, Cape Verde, or Cabo Verde in Portuguese, has reached gender parity. I would like to repeat, Cabo Verde has reached gender parity among those aged between 15 and 24, even in rural areas where the literacy rate, so overall, is 98%, even for women, for girls. But if the next steps, which means after the step of universal education, after the 98% literacy rate, so if the next steps are not properly addressed, universal education, instead of feeding the demographic dividend in Africa, it will feed the demographic nightmare. Because provides high school certified girls, but not knowledge and informed girls to compete for jobs and financing. So from an African policy making standpoint, make knowledge available to girls and women should be considered not only a public good, but also economic growth tool. Knowledge cannot be provided in the same way as formal education. In this particular, policy making needs to be reset. This brings us to digitalization and the massive use of ICT platforms to deliver knowledge and information. And this brings us to another issue that I will just mention, but not touch. The intellectual property barriers that have been preventing Africa of accessing innovation, science, and technology to address development challenges. As I used to say, it's not chasing the 0.7% in ODA flows that will face COVID. No, this is backward thinking. This is backward. We need to stop chasing the 0.7% in ODA flows. We have been chasing, African policymakers, we have been chasing in the past 30 years, and we have not found it. Maybe it's lost, I don't know. So let's reset in this perspective. So policymaking should make policymakers should make access to knowledge and information a critical element for the economic empowerment of women, girls, which in my view goes beyond the goal of overcoming poverty. At the end of my remarks, I will address this issue. My second critical element is the lack of assets to access transformative financing and break the vicious cycle of microcredit as a tool to perpetuate poverty. The question here, again, from a policy-making standpoint, or the questions actually in the plural, the questions here, again, from a policy-making standpoint, are essentially three. First, the lack of strong risk-sharing mechanisms treated as income distribution tools. So the accepted common ground is that in order to be considered by banking intermediation, we need to have assets. If you do not have assets, you cannot access banking intermediation. And you all know that banks dominate the financial risk return business in our economies. Second, land. In Africa, this is crucial. Access to land as the major access to empower economic girls and women. So the lack of formal title to land limits access, as we know, to credit and to the ability to build assets. Please allow me to introduce a different dimension of access to land in these tough periods of instability and terrorism in Africa. People might think that there is no relationship. But we need to realize that one of the reasons that terrorism is flourishing in Africa reflects, among other things, the lack of control by the state of the territory. In the 60s, we narrate, right after our independence, we narrate a colonial state basically performing two functions, collecting taxes and imposing order on a colonial perspective. My question is, after 40, 50 years after our independence, have we succeeded in changing the profile of these states? So going back to land as an asset to empower women, what is the relationship? Instead of having problems controlling territory, and in a very direct and silent way, promoting, entre guillemets, terrorism, let's give the land back to women and promote control of the territory. At the same time, promoting income distribution. So the third aspect that I would like to raise is we need to change the mindset, Barbara. We need to recognize first that micro, small, and medium enterprise produce savings. They do produce savings. Second, these savings need to be intermediated outside of the traditional commercial banking sector. Third, by promoting financial institutions with a different profile that leverage intangible assets and mutual accountability mechanisms as collateral. So the challenge of all of us, and I'm about to finish, the challenge for all of us is to realize that managing development is not managing poverty. Policy making has been equating managing poverty to managing development, but these are two different animals. And when debating economic empowerment for women by putting microcredit at the center of policy making, this is managing poverty, but not managing development. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you. You've introduced so many things that I would love to explore further, but then I might be stepping outside my role today. But let me just comment. What I was hearing is the way in which you were discussing, if you like, interlocking barriers, that taking one barrier and challenging it in a sectoral sense maybe is successful in a certain kind of way, but doesn't actually address what you said that was needed overall in terms of the change of the mindset or the framing of the overall objective. What I think you characterized as whether we are trying to reduce poverty, eradicate poverty, or really pursue sustainable development. And I think some of what that must really mean for policy directions is to challenge ourselves to measure what we're doing as to whether it's basically trying to improve things within the existing frameworks and redistribute a little, or whether it's actually looking at whether the frameworks themselves are taking us in the direction that we want to go in this regard and highlighting key things. If countries, if small island developing states or countries in Africa cannot retain their own wealth, then they can't use it to pursue their development. Domestic resource mobilization as the main thing going forward means addressing a lot of the issues you discussed. Intellectual property rights, for example. I'm not sure that this is going to be fair on Alexander Girvan, because we are now going to turn to Alexander for his comments and remarks, and your training, your scholarship, your experience actually really combine environmental and economic sciences, two things that aren't always seen or recognized as sufficiently complementary. And your work, I think, is also very much connected to real experiences in the Caribbean as well as in the global context and across a large range of institutions. So the question really is huge, and you're going to get a whole of 5 minutes to tackle it. My apologies. What is the complementary role that the state, private sector, civil society, and international community can respectively play to advance women's economic participation?
Barbara, thank you so much. My video
I don't see you, but I do see you. Okay.
I think my video is frozen, so I'll let the IT people address that. Thank you so much for having me here with these titans, these female leaders who are really pushing things forward. I'll answer your question about partnership first, and then I'll move on to your question about this whole idea of revising the framework and looking at economic indicators and why they're flawed. I had the pleasure of interviewing Barbados's minister in the Ministry of Finance, Marcia Cattle, about equity in the development of Barbados's economic recovery and transformation program. Now, you see, in developing this program, the government had numerous consultations with its peoples, communities, women's groups, and they largely endeavored to be gender inclusive. You see, this was not a consultation of in the room deciding what the deal with the IMF would be. Barbadians were consulted and asked, what do you value? What sacrifices are you willing to make for a potentially better future? And I think this is a type of partnership that will move us forward. One based on listening and genuine consultation. Now, that's the role of the government. Regarding civil society, I challenge civil society to play not only a watchdog role, but also the role of shepherd and communicator, ensuring the values of people on the ground are considered in the planning, budgets, and metrics of governments in the private sector. You see, these partnerships are required and each actor plays their role. Excuse me. The international community and multilateral thought have proven to be consistent mechanisms for collective self-improvement through competing to be better. Now, coming down to this idea of the framework needs revising, I think we really need to focus on revising our economic indicators of success. Governments and businesses should be reporting to social and environmental standards, and gender inclusive accounting and accounting for nature's contribution to people through natural capital should really be the norm. Barbara, I'm not sure why my video is not activated. I don't know if IT could help us get the video up. All right, here we go. Fantastic. I hope you guys can see me.
Yeah.
All right, great. So talking about indicators, well, GDP is actually a failed and sexist indicator. You know, anything done at home, unpaid care, and most things done in an informal economy are not at all included in GDP figures. So by undervaluing these essential services, we plan poorly and invest poorly in them because we assume that women will continue to take up these gender assigned roles. And COVID has kind of slapped us in the face with this because COVID has proven the magnitude of the burden that women face and the consequences of poor planning because our economies are going to suffer if people are not taking up the mantle. So I think with revised indicators, we're more likely to invest in the things that have the best chance to sustain our economies in the future, which are creative industries, and I'm speaking specifically in the Caribbean, creative industries, advanced food processing, and experience-based tourism, which Prime Minister spoke so eloquently to a few weeks ago in her speech to the, I think, IDB. And in all of these industries, women continue to play a pioneering role. Now, if we pay attention to this, small businesses have the potential to become massive new industries. And I just want to bring an example again from Barbados, and sorry for picking positively on Barbados today. You know, lack of social investment and the exclusion of female voices is why the value of a controlling stake in Victoria's Secret has shrunk to $1 billion US. While Barbados' own businesswoman and designer, Robin Fenty, some people may know her as Rihanna, her fashion company is worth almost $4 billion. Now, I mean, you would think the question, why is a board of white men making underwear for the world's woman would have come up before 2020? And see, that's the truth. When women are not at the table or not given the opportunity to helm the ship, you know, empires like Victoria's Secret can crumble, but also we collectively leave billions of dollars unearned. But I'm exceedingly hopeful because, you know, while Rihanna is special as a titan of business, she's not unique as a Caribbean woman, particularly in the cultural industries, where there are many diamonds in the rough. Now, I personally know about 17 of my aunties that could make a pepper sauce that would make tobacco.
I'm asking your forgiveness, but because I'm thoroughly enjoying and you've got us all smiling, but I'm really going to ask you to take another minute, please. We will keep smiling, but I'm sorry to have to be the timekeeper right now.
I'm very close. So I was, you know, highlighting these aunties that could make Tabasco sweat, you know, in a business sense. And I think, you know, I know multiple female leaders of Carnival who could sell cultural and logistical services to every World Cup, Olympic event, and Carnival to the end of time. You know, Caribbean female filmmakers and artists are already defining global styles, and we have multiple female cultural icons, young and old, who channel the energy of Jamaica's Miss Louise Bennett and who create $1 billion cultural tourism experience. The fact is, many of these people exist, but are not invested in or promoted due to gender, outdated concepts of societal role, and limited access to healthcare and contraception. I focus on creative industries because other people speak to science, and I just want to end with one thing. I'm really inspired by the young women of today. More and more they articulate and become aware of their own power. And I have full confidence in their ability to lead. So I want to end with a challenge for men. They say intelligence is the ability to contemplate a thought without accepting it. I challenge men to be more intelligent and contemplate the world from the perspective of the women around them. This is something I have to constantly remind myself to do, and I'm happy to continue in this lifelong learning. It provides that. And I finally want to end with an Arundhati Roy quote. You know, Arundhati Roy says, "Another word is possible, but she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." So I want to challenge us all to listen.
Thank you. You know, we would not all be here together in this conversation if we didn't believe and know that another world is possible. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Peterson, I don't know how. I'm really, I'm not asking you to do a summary. How could you? It's been such a rich and full conversation, and it's also put so many things on this agenda that actually need further explanation. But please help us with some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm almost a bit hesitant after having been challenged by Alexander now. So, but luckily someone made a script for me, so I'll try to follow part of that. And then, but I like the idea, and thank you very much for that and for your input. And thank you to you, Barbara, for really ably moderating this discussion. It has been a really giving experience. Let me first of all thank also the other participants, of whom are very good friends. Good to see you all again. But of course, distinguished speakers, Honorable Mia Motke, Undersecretary General Fekitia Mola. I will stop there because I never learned to pronounce the rest of the name, but we are very good friends, so I know she will bear over with me. Special Advisor Christina Duarte, Teresa Turner-Jones, Alexander Girvan, and of course our very own Dr. Natalia Kanem, who inspires us every day, so that's a pleasure. And let me also pay tribute to the Bishop Anstey High School Steel Band Ensemble for the fantastic performance, the energy that they showed. This is what we all know. It's all about the young people. That's what is center for our efforts to see the realization of the ICPD agenda. So I think we should definitely thank them again. This was a truly inspiring conversation, and I think it was fitting for as the last one in the series to have this conversation with the subject, and it brought back focus to the full circle of the women's agency, as we say, the core of the ICPD agenda. And I think also discussing with this critical topic from the perspective of small island developing states, where you have so many people which are further behind or furthest behind, where you have literally distance to the rest of the world, and where you have a lot of challenges. I think this is really both appropriate, but it was also symbolic to have that focus. This journey with the webinars started back in June, as you know, with a conversation on ensuring continuity of essential health services and promoting equality and rights. And along the way, we have explored women's agency from a rights-based perspective, bringing us to today's final discourse on charting the path forward. And I think we really got a lot of good points, a lot of elements we put into the discussion. And I like really what you said, Barbara, when we talked about the COVID, because I think that there's this realization that we may have achieved in many aspects progress, but we cannot take them for granted because things can happen suddenly. And in this case, it's just coming in, and it's over all of us, and we need to really adjust to that. But I think I like your expression that maybe we shouldn't say build back, but build a new and better beginning, because some of the old cultures and the old things are not those that we want to achieve again. It's all about helping women to overcome economic inequalities and end poverty, as well as the role of all stakeholders. And I think we got that into the discussion as well, and not least with Alexander's point made here at the last. When women are, when they're not empowered to have agency over their bodies and lives, they're being denied as equal partners in development. And where women are not equal partners in development cannot be achieved. That's something that we really need to remind ourselves all the time. So our collective recognition of the urgency of gender equality and women's empowerment in the is the fuel that will propel us forward. And the 1,250 commitments made last year in Nairobi by you, our partners, all of us across the globe, is the vehicle that will move us towards our shared goals. And I think this has been underlined in this discussion as well. One element I would like to also just reiterate from Christina Duarte's intervention is the issue of access. I think that is so basic also and needs to be brought into the discussion. It's sometimes forgotten, but this is about access to education, access to decision-making, access to banks, as was called there, as was the focus there. But this is, we cannot have this discussion without that dimension into the picture. So once again, I thank you all very much on behalf of all of us at UNFPA, where I'm very proud to be on the team now, and for your participation and continued commitment in advancing the unfinished ICPD agenda. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much. And I will add my voice to your thanks, to your comments, and to the wonderful contributions and the stimulation that we have had today. I'd like to say, I'd like us to recognize how far we've come. We are naming how much we have to do. But, you know, we used to 25 longer years ago, we often talked about women as victims in society. We were very aware of how women were basically invisible to policies, invisible in institutions and in systems. And I think that we now know the way that we are all working, the way we're working together, the way that we have actually managed to make sure that women isn't treated as a sector, as with others, but is absolutely understood to be essential for enjoying rights and for a sustainable and thriving livelihoods and economy. And we integrate that. We have different strategies and different entry points, but I think we really understand that. And so I think we should, on the one hand, congratulate ourselves and thank ourselves, but also I'm going to leave you with a different kind of thank you. I'm going to thank you for all the work we are still going to do, and for all the work we still have to do. And Natalia, don't take this personally, but I really hope we don't need a Nairobi plus 25. Thank you all very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.